Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10, hosted by Tom Fox. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Stories from the week of July 2023. Next up, a story from Radio Free Europe that Unilever has added its name to the Ukrainian National Agency on Corruption Prevention's list of sponsors of war, goods against war, saying that the owner of hundreds of international brands has announced its decision to quit the Russian market over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Certainly a positive step for both Unilever and the Ukraine for Russia to do so. Nevertheless, you might want to ask why this took them so long to do so, but at least they finally did. And our final story comes to us from Business Insider, and it reports that Pakistan's government made overnight changes on July 2nd to make more strident anti-corruption laws in the wake of the arrest of former Premier Imran Khan and his appearance before the company's Apex Anti-Graft Investigation Agency. The changes were made on, it was done to hopefully ramp up the charges against the former premier, and that it's going to be interesting to see how and what the result will be going forward. A recent California Supreme Court case which increased the rights of whistleblowers. The claim required or allowed, rather, employees who disclose information even to an agency or a company that previously had the information is given whistleblower protection. Prior law said that if the information was already known, there was no whistleblower protection available. A very interesting article from the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal. The biggest U.S. banks are going to have to demonstrate they haven't gotten so large that they're unwieldy or they'll face a potential breakup. What's so interesting about this is that it was indeed the Fed and the OCC said they wanted more concentration of banks in the wake of the SVB bank failure. So obviously this is inconsistent, but banks are going to have to be able to manage themselves in a way that demonstrates they can do so, and that will not lead to its own set of compliance issues. Our next story comes to us from PBS, which reports on the corruption in the country of Lebanon and how not only has the corruption devastated the country's economy, but the country cannot pull out of its economic doldrums because so much of the nation's gross national product is stolen by corruption. It really demonstrates not only why Lebanon is a failed state, but the true impact of corruption and the invidiousness of corruption damages people, places, and things in a wide variety of ways beyond simply the theft of money. So a really interesting report from PBS on this issue. Our next story comes to us from Reuters, which says that the SEC has charged the window maker View and its ex-CFO over accounting frauds. View is a maker of smart windows who tinted panels adjust with the sun, and the former chief financial officer for understating the cost of replacing defective windows. Apparently, there was a large number of windows that had to be replaced. View itself will not have to pay a fine because it reported the error, took remedial action, and cooperated with the SEC. However, former CFO Vidul Prakash was charged with negligence-based fraud, disclosure, and books and records violations. The View went through a $1.6 billion merger with Cantor Fitzgerald, and the case arose from a defective sealing component in View's smart windows. According to the SEC, View disclosed $22 to $25 million in liabilities when it turns out they were between $48 million to $53 million. So not only be safe out there, but be honest and truthful out there. Next up, another story from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal. This time, Dylan Tokar reporting that a former top London police officer will head the Serious Fraud Office. Nick Upgrave will succeed Lisa Osofsky, whose tenure at the agency was marked by several high-profile corporate settlements, but a disastrous series of courtroom defeats and leadership controversies. Upgrave, a former assistant commissioner for the Met, will begin an initial 5-year term as the SFO's director in late September. He is the first non-lawyer to head the FCO, as prior directors had significant experience as public prosecutors. Osofsky, a dual U.S.-UK citizen, had served as a federal prosecutor in the United States as well as a deputy general counsel for the FBI. She also held jobs at Goldman Sachs and 2 risk consultancies. The SFO, unlike the DOJ, houses both investigators and prosecutors and has a broader remit. The reputation of the SFO was seriously damaged during Osofsky's tenure, and we can only hope that she will be able to bring it back in a way that reintroduces confidence into the SFO. Next up, in a very interesting op-ed piece from Edward Luce at the Financial Times, he discusses the moral bankruptcy of the Ivy League and the Ivy League America. There's been a series of articles about education in the wake of the Supreme Court destroying affirmative action in the United States. And the real problem is that nearly 50% of all college admissions are either legacies, meaning their parents went to that university, athletes under scholarship, or kids of staff and or professors. And when you leave 50% open for the rest of the world or admissions, that's going to make for a very small pool. Now, when you layer on disadvantaged minorities who've never really been given a chance or for other historical reasons have not had success at that university or those universities, particularly the Ivy League universities, you begin to see the problem. One can only hope that universities will look at economic disadvantage or other factors which will help them bring disadvantaged youths to such universities, but this Supreme Court is dead set against giving any type of assistance to minorities going forward. So Ivy League universities, according to Mr. Luce, are going to have to answer this clarion call. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. As I mentioned in the prior episode, this is the one request I've received most often from podcast listeners of the Daily Compliance News to put together a summary at week's end so that every compliance professional can catch up on the news quite quickly. So I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review for this new podcast addition to the Compliance Podcast Network family, 10 for 10. If you've got an idea for a podcast, I'd love to hear from you. I start many shows based upon ideas from listeners. So give me a shout. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. 10 for 10 is a proud member of the Compliance Podcast Network.